The wind immediately begins to stir up dust from the dry ground. A few deer you spot in the distance are so thin you can see their ribs as they pick their way through the scattered juniper trees. The grass is sparse, and everywhere you look, the landscape is brown and dry. Droughts restrict many things in Utah, including fireworks, lawn watering, and closing some boat ramps. But here is a look at how it impacts some of the state's animals, including deer and livestock. This is Wild, a Utah Division of Wildlife Resources podcast. I'm your host, Faith Heaton-Jolly, and this is episode 21, Big Game Drought Impacts. Welcome back to Wild. We are here in studio today, and I've got three fun guests. They're all super nice to drive in this morning from their various locations around the state. So we have Justin Shannon. He is the wildlife section chief here for the division. And then we have Nicole Nielsen. She's the restoration biologist for our southeastern region out in Price. Great little spot of the state. And then we have Troy Forrest, and he's with the Department of Ag.
I'm the director of the Grazing Improvement Program at the Utah Department of Agriculture and Food.
Okay, awesome. And I'll kind of have you guys explain how long you've been with each of the agencies and kind of what it is that you do, because these are fancy titles, but most people have no idea what they mean. So, Justin, let's start with you.
Thanks, Faith. So I've been with the Division of Wildlife for about 13 years, and I've served as a wildlife biologist and a wildlife program manager in Southeast Utah and the big game coordinator in now this position. So that's kind of my journey in the wildlife agency.
Okay. And have you mostly worked with big game during that time, or have you done all sorts of wildlife?
No, I've had a variety of experiences, but my focus has been big game mostly.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, and then Nicole.
So I've been with the agency going on 12 years this year. I have mostly been the restoration biologist, but I did start out as the oil and gas biologist working with industry to kind of mitigate impacts to various wildlife.
Awesome. And for those that have been following the podcast, this is Nicole's second appearance on the show. She's a glutton for punishment, so she's back.
I love it.
Yep. We did a fun little episode down by Price, actually, about one of her habitat projects down there. Yeah, and then Troy, tell us a little bit about what it is you do for the Department of Ag.
Well, I started off, it's been about 23 years ago, with the conservation districts. And I worked on a contract for the Department of Ag, but I wasn't an actual department employee till 2010. The Grazing Improvement Program started in 2006. I've worked on it since its inception, first contractually, and then officially in 2010 moved over to the department and became a state employee. So I was involved at the coordinator level. I covered the 10 northern counties to begin with, and in about 2014 or so took over the administration of the program over the entire of the state. So I've been with Department of Ag or around it for 20-something years, officially for 10, I guess, 11. So
that's awesome. So you're a long-timer government employee.
That's why all my hair is gray or white. And
Yeah, that's the reason. Yeah.
That's awesome. So today we're talking about, it's kind of a more depressing topic, maybe. Anyone that lives in Utah is familiar with the fact that we're in a drought right now. We've had some level of drought for the last couple of years, but this year, 90% of the state is experiencing what they're calling extreme drought conditions. So earlier in March, Governor Cox basically declared a state of emergency due to the drought conditions. And so things are a little dire. Obviously, drought impacts everything, right? A lot of different aspects of life, but it also impacts, animals, livestock, and wildlife. So we wanted to kind of touch on some of those impacts and kind of what that means for the average Joe here in the state. Let's kind of start talking about wildlife. And then specifically, let's talk about, Justin, what are some of the impacts of drought on big game like deer and elk specifically?
Yeah, so when it comes to drought for big game, not all big game species are impacted equally. So animals like deer are impacted a lot more severely than animals like elk. And if you look at the diet of a deer, they're a selected concentrate feeder. And so if you look at the face of a big game animal, like a pronghorn or a deer, it's really narrow and long, and that implies that it needs the most nutritious parts of a plant. And so when you have drought, some things don't flower, some things don't produce as well as they could. Our forb community declines and different things like that. The food that deer really rely on to get big and to put on weight and to have good body condition scores, those types of things are not as readily available on the landscape. So they're impacted harder, and we've seen that over the last several years. I mean, we're several years into a drought. This year's certainly really bad, but 2-3 years ago was really bad, and we haven't been getting the precip that we've needed. And so for deer populations, they've been on the decline, and Mother Nature has done that. And then when it comes to animals like elk, they're more of a grazer type animal. So in those cases, we look really hard at making sure that elk populations are below their carrying capacities and their population objectives. And so that way there's no harm to the habitat and those types of things. And really at the foundation of it, whether we're talking about wildlife or agriculture, is we need that base vegetative component to be in good health. For us, we feel it's appropriate to reduce elk populations during drought and making sure that our landscapes are healthy.
Because obviously they're doing most of their eating, like fattening up basically during the spring and summer to kind of tide them over for winter, right?
Yeah, and different parts of the state have different conditions. So like you look at southern Utah where they really rely on that monsoonal moisture in August. We didn't get a lot of that last year. And so you had dry conditions and the time of relief didn't come in late summer. And so that really impacts some of the vegetation that relies on that precipitation later in the summer. Northern Utah, not so much. They usually get heavier winters, later springs, and we didn't get that. We didn't get the snowpack that we've needed, and so our soils are really dry. Our vegetation is is lacking in a lot of cases, and so it's just hard. And you contrast that. I remember being at an open house 10 years ago. We invited the public to come to Price and talk about deer. And I had a question by a member of the public, and he said, when are we going to get back to deer populations being what they were like in the 80s? This individual grew up
the good old days.
The glory days.
We hear about it. Yep.
This individual started hunting in the 80s, and just everything has been not as good since then, from his opinion. This was about 2010 or 11. And we went back and looked at the data, and myself and Brad Crompton, a biologist in the Southeast region, we looked at what the 1980s had to provide from an environmental perspective. And every year from like 1980 to 1989, 10 years in a row, we had above average precipitation.
Oh, wow. I
remember I recently found an old KSL article, and it said in June 1982, Salt Lake received over 4 inches of rain in that month alone. And so so it's really interesting is, our deer herds are struggling right now, and we do have drought on the landscape. But you contrast that to the 80s when everybody says deer hunting was really, really good and populations were thriving. We were also above average precipitation for a decade. And that's how you really grow deer, is you don't just have 1 or 2 good years. You have to have back-to-back-to-back good years. And when you get that, you can grow a lot of deer. We saw that in the mid-2010s, and from 2012 to 2016 or so, sometime in that time frame, where we grew close to 100,000 deer in 4 years. And so if you get good environmental conditions back-to-back-to-back, you can really start to grow deer. And when you don't, and you miss the monsoonal moisture, and you miss some of that precip, your deer herds struggle a little bit.
Sure. So if someone can figure out how to control the weather, we'd be golden.
Yeah, you'd have a golden ticket.
Right.
Ride it anywhere you wanted.
And that back-to-back concept goes for plants, too, because it'll take a few years for these plants to recover. They need to rebuild their root mass and rebuild the plant health. So even if we got, a great winter this next year, it's not just going to change overnight.
Sure. It takes a while to kind of lay that foundation, and yeah, that makes sense to me. And so do we see a lot of deer or, kind of basically starving to death during the winter when it is like a really bad drought year and they don't put on the fat they need going into the winter? Yeah,
so there's a few things we see when deer don't put on good fat reserves. One is we radio collar 800-900 deer a year, and we monitor their survival and their body condition and some of those things. And the younger deer in particular, like this year's fawns and some of that, in the spring, if it's a bad year, we'll have a lot of these animals die of starvation. And it's kind of sad. I mean, Nicole and I have actually seen it. We've gone up under juniper trees and on our winter ranges outside of Price, and there's just dead fawns curled up under a tree, and they've starved to death. And there's a variety of things going on. I mean, throughout drought, the moms don't produce enough milk, or they don't have enough nutrients in that milk to get them started on a path of putting on a ton of weight going into the winter. And then certainly when they transition to vegetation, the vegetation isn't high enough quality for them to pack a lot of fat reserves. And so it's really unfortunate, but I would say our younger animals suffer the most from it. But does do as well. You know, when you have drought, maybe instead of having twins, you have one fawn, and so your production and your recruitment is also set back a little bit.
Yeah,
so
that makes sense.
And it might even go a step further than that, you know, maybe they're not even having a fawn that year, and then, you know, they need a year to recoup their body condition so that they can have a fawn the next year. So maybe they're only having one fawn every other year.
Yeah, that makes sense. I just had a baby, and so I'm like, this is really resonating. Like, I'm starving when I have a baby. Like, I eat so much, and I get nice and fat. And so I'm like, yeah, that would be hard if you didn't have enough food to, like, support you and your baby. And anyway.
Just real quick, you know, it's interesting when we talk about deer, because as biologists, we look at populations, but it's a lot of individuals that make up these populations. And we get asked all the time, how do you grow big deer? How do you get a big buck? How does that happen? And there's really 4 things that contribute to growing a large animal. One of them is genetics, and everybody wants to talk about it. And I think it's the thing we know the least about, but it does play a role, and it's important. The other is age. So obviously, the older an animal gets, the bigger it's going to get. It has to grow its long bones and its structure, and then it adds fat later on and those types of things. The third one is nutrition. And so how much groceries are on the landscape for these deer. If there's a lot, they'll get bigger, and if there's not, they won't.
Sure.
And then the fourth thing is kind of interesting, and I think you've talked about it on your podcast before, but it's the condition of the mom when during gestation. And so in a drought year like this, it doesn't just have impacts for this year. 4 or 5 years down the road, some of these bucks, when hunters want really big animals, they're set back from inception, essentially.
Right.
And so they may not be able to have the capacity to grow as big as they could have because of drought conditions 5 years previously.
Yeah,
so.
That's super interesting, kind of the ripple effect that goes through. Yeah, that is really interesting. And so kind of talking about, you know, we've obviously been touching on wildlife. Troy, what are some of the impacts of drought on, like, our livestock and those kind of herds as well during a drought?
Well, a lot of it's very similar. I mean, they're animals, they react the same way. But our ranchers have to kind of look ahead and you know, even this last year, many of our ranchers on their winter ranges went out with half or less of their numbers on their BLM permits. You know, I know of several guys that didn't go out at all because they didn't feel like the resources were available. And, you know, one producer in south central Utah was feeding a $6,000 load of hay every week to his cows because normally they would be out on BLM. He'd be paying $1.34 a month for them.
To graze,
right? To graze.
But and there's no feed. Yeah.
But there was no feed, and he could see that, you know, no water to push him on. He'd have been hauling water. And to protect the resource, you know, they want to protect the golden goose. And that is that grass and its ability to grow. And so most of them will take drastic steps ahead of time to make sure that resource is going to be available in the future for them. And so luckily the agencies haven't been draconian in their cuts. BLM and Forest Service hasn't came to our producers and said, you know, you can only go out with 15% or 50% of your numbers. But our producers, of their own accord in most cases, have said, I'm not going to go out with my full numbers.
Oh, wow.
Or I am going to go out with my full numbers, but I know that I'm going to come home early and that I've got to find a place. And you know, in our southern deserts, we've bred a breed of cow or sheep that can perform in those landscapes. And what these producers fear most is having to sell those genetics that they've developed for an area here in Utah, have it go down the road, because you can't buy a cow that came off a pasture in Big Piney Wyoming, and ask her to survive on the desert in southern Utah. You'll dump her out, and she'll look around and want to get back on the trailer. She'll say, "What have you done to me? This is not right."
What is this place?
And so, that genetic, that knowledge those mother cows teach to their daughters, to know the range, to know where water is, to know what they can eat and survive and not ingest something that's poisonous or whatever, is critical to our ranchers. And they'll do all they can to keep that. As we go into worsening drought right now, guys are selling off before they go to the Forest Service. If a cow's old or has a limp, she's down the road kicking rocks. She's done on the ranch, just to try to survive. They'll try to keep the young cows, and if it gets worse, and what we're facing now is kind of unprecedented, because we're coming off winter ranges that weren't good when we went on, and they're gone. And we didn't have any rain at all this year. Normally, as we leave our winter ranges, we get some rain in May and April that helps that to regenerate and grow. In most areas of the state, we got none of that. And that means that there's going to be nothing to go back to next fall. Because unless it's a monsoonal-dependent system, which we have a few, the cool season grasses have done their thing this year. They're not going to have an opportunity. A lot of our west desert and southern Utah, cheatgrass didn't even germinate this year. I mean, even cheatgrass that we don't consider a high-class forage, but when it doesn't even grow, there's nothing there.
There's a problem, yeah.
Bare spots. I mean, just look at even on the Wasatch Front here, the past few weeks, as the winds have come up, how much dust is in the air. That's directly attributable to this drought. We hear of the Dust Bowl days of the 30s, and we're in a situation where we could be facing that. As good as the 80s were before it, the 70s were bad.
Great.
Incredibly bad. And I remember as a young kid watching the water trucks come. We had one of the best wells in Monticello, was right between my uncle and mine's house. And water trucks were coming in and out of there hauling water for livestock on a daily basis. And producers were doing that just to keep their herds alive.
Sure.
Because there was nothing to drink. And, our program over the last several years has done a ton of water development. We have thousands of additional watering spots on the ground. But without rain to regenerate wells and springs, some of those aren't there. And so there will be guys hauling water to what they have this year. And if wildlife drink it, that's part of the game. And they're more than happy to provide that. And all of the water sources we develop, not only do the livestock use them, but they're critical to wildlife. And wildlife use and benefit from those sources. And ranchers are aware of that, and in almost all cases excited to have that resource and to keep it alive. So
yeah. And go ahead, Nicole.
And Troy, correct me if I'm wrong, but for wildlife, in these drought conditions, these plants just don't have the same nutrition. And I would assume that goes for cows as well as wildlife. So, these plants, they're not growing as big, so there's just not that biomass there. But they're also deficient in nutrients that these animals can use. So that's for livestock and wildlife. So the drought has like this really big cascading effect on, anything that uses those ranges.
Right. So it's not even that there's not enough plants. The plants that there are, they're still not doing the job, like feeding them and fattening them up. Yeah.
Yeah. And for instance, last year across the board, our weaning weights on lambs and calves were down about 10%.
Oh, wow.
So on a 500-pound calf, that means there was 50 less pounds of calf to sell when it comes time to market it. And that's directly attributable to the lack of nutrition in that forage. And frankly, the lack of volume. It's just not there, and that will continue. The other thing that we see, and you see it in the wildlife as well, is your breed back. I mean, if a female isn't in a good enough body condition score, she won't breed because her body isn't ready to give up those resources. And so she'll not be receptive to breeding, or she'll breed very late in the season. Typically we most of the producers in Utah try to breed in May and June when we have the very best nutrition on the ground on a typical year. Maybe not that way this year, so that we can have our calves in March and April of next year. For a cow, the patrician period is just like a human, is 9 months. And so that schedule, we try to work with it. But what we saw last summer, after the dry summer, is a whole bunch of cows came home open. And most of those cows we didn't keep. They went to the sale barn, and that will continue. And it's a self-perpetuating mess. To make up for the lack of nutrients in the forage, there's a lot of supplementation. You'll see big tubs of protein or blocks of protein. That's the producers trying to make up for that deficiency.
That's like the salt and mineral that they're putting out.
Some of it's salt, some of it's actually pure protein.
Oh, wow.
And it is limited by salt. They put enough salt in it that the cows will only eat, or the sheep will only eat so much. But it's a pure protein source so that they can take that forage that's basically straw and convert it into something useful, which is amazing that a cow can do. If you give a cow a little protein, you can feed her literally straw, and she can make good nutrition out of it with a protein source. And they're amazing in that way. And that's the thing that's different about livestock is we can supplement their forage. We can add 10 pounds of alfalfa to the ground, and they can get by on poorer quality shrubs and stuff. Often with wildlife, you don't have that luxury, because if you try to change their feed, and Justin can correct me if I'm wrong, but you can kill them because that shot of protein is too much and puts them in a dire strait.
Gotcha. And you touched a little on the grazing aspect of things, and kind of explained for those that aren't familiar why it's bad to kind of overgraze an area. You'd said a lot of the ranchers are voluntarily not putting their cows out because they know there's limited feed right now, so they're just paying to feed them, or they're feeding them their own hay or whatever that they've raised. Talk a little about why it is bad to kind of overgraze an area and that balance.
Okay. Well, if you want to think about a plant, whether it's a grass plant or a shrub or a forb of some kind, basically it's a solar system, and it has to have leaf material as its solar panels, like on your house. That's what it uses to create energy. And so it has to have some of that solar panel remaining, or it has no way to convert the mineral nutrition that's in the soil into something useful. So we've got to leave something there for the plants to make hay. And so that's why we try to get in, we graze. The rule of thumb for us is take half, leave half. When we leave an area, we want half of that plant remaining, because that way it has some solar panels. It can regrow if it has moisture and has those nutrients. Without it, if we take it too far where there's no solar panels left, we risk killing that plant. And then opportunist plants that we don't want are going to come in and take over.
Weeds
and that's what
invasive stuff.
Weeds and invasive things that we don't want, that nothing wants to eat, whether it's deer or livestock or whatever the case may be. And so that's why it's so important to grazers that they recognize that take half, keep half mentality is forefront in their mind. And sometimes they may have a small sacrifice area on their private land where they can put their cows to feed them or whatever, but they try to limit that in scope, because they know that what they want is that solar panel, that system, to be productive. It takes the water that we're lacking in the drought, it takes that nutrition in the soil, but ultimately those plants are solar factories. And that's the incredible thing about these systems, is we have something that can take sunlight and mineral soil and water and make something that we can all enjoy and eat and partake of. So.
Sure. Yeah, and it is just a delicate balance for sure. And so we've kind of touched on both of these. Obviously, deer, elk, livestock, they're all using some of these same resources. So is it very common during drought years like this year for them to kind of compete for some of these limited food and water resources that are available?
Yeah, I would say absolutely, because if you look at a landscape, there's the vegetation that comes up, and we share it. Agriculture has animals on the landscape, and deer and elk are also on that same landscape. And that's why during these drought years, it's important that we communicate with our friends and partners in the agricultural community, because we don't want to get in a tug-of-war over these types of things. You look at elk right now. Elk and cattle compete pretty closely when it comes to the grasses and other vegetation that they want to take, and
they like to eat the same kind of stuff.
They do. They got similar tastes, but it's one where we're meeting with our wildlife managers here for second week of June to look at our elk populations and look at the drought conditions, and looking at areas where we need to offer more permits to the hunting public to reduce those herds. It's appropriate to do that, to reduce densities on drought years. We'll grow them back. It's a renewable resource if you treat it correctly and with respect. But if we overgraze, whether it's from a wildlife perspective or an agricultural perspective, and we get in these tug of wars instead of communicating and partnering and supporting each other and really looking out for the common goal, and that's the health of the landscape, then we can do damage, and that's hard to get back. And some of these systems that don't have good soil types or not a lot of annual rainfall, they're pretty sensitive. And so, there's competition that can occur, and I think it's important that we communicate and figure out what we can do to do our part to make sure that stress is alleviated. So.
Yeah, totally. And you kind of touched on, offering additional hunting permits. What are some of the other kind of tools that were available to offer, if ranchers are struggling to be able to feed their cattle and there is kind of this competition that they're seeing? What are some options that they have?
I don't know, Troy, you want to talk? I mean, I can talk real quickly on things like depredation. A lot of times when you're dealing with agricultural use or landowners are trying to grow a crop, on a drought year, we're going to have a lot more deer and elk that are attracted to those areas. You look at the landscape and there's not much there, and then there's a giant green field that's really high in nutrients and protein.
Everybody's coming running.
Yeah, and they suck in there. And so it's important that we work with these landowners at a local landscape, because it's a time of year or a given year with high drought where deer and elk really are attracted to those fields. But it's also a hard year for ranchers and that community that are saying, I'm already struggling because our cows are putting on less weight, we're not taking as many out, and we have a lot of elk in our field. And so we need to find tools, and some of those tools involve like us herding or hazing elk out. Sometimes, a lot of times, we give landowners permits to remove some of those animals. We've done removals in the past.
And that's where we'll kind of donate the meat and things like that to different families. Yeah,
and that's a great program. Yes,
yeah.
I mean, when we do a removal, it's going to a family. That animal has value, and that meat's important, and so it's not something that we're interested in wasting.
Sure.
But anyways, it takes good, honest, candid communication, and I think drought years are hard for wildlife that are lacking, and ranchers and that community that are saying, it's just, I don't know how much tolerance I have when there's twice as many elk in here as we're used to having, because there's less on the landscape. So.
Totally. Yeah.
And what's interesting is we do have in Utah a CWMU program that compensates landowners very well for keeping wildlife on their land, and that has been a very beneficial problem. A lot of the places where we have a bigger rub are on the public lands where the grazers have leased the grazing, and we've talked about over the years, how can we compensate these ranchers that have leased this grass in a similar way, where they get some benefit for being more tolerant of wildlife, because those agencies have standards that they have to meet as they go out and graze, and sometimes that's a stubble height. There has to be 4 inches of stubble left, and when you hit that point, livestock have to leave. What gets to our producers is a lot of times they go to the mountain and the elk or the deer or whatever has already been there, and there's not 4 inches when they get there.
Oh.
And so they really can't even turn out because it's already gone. And a drought just exacerbates that to the nth degree. And so that can develop resentment, especially if it's just a public lands guys that doesn't have a CWMU at home, that he gets a benefit from wildlife. To him, they are just direct competition with his bottom line, because the only way he gets a check is to sell that calf or to sell that lamb. And if he loses that opportunity, or instead of it costing him, $30 a month to run on BLM or Forest Service for the summer, he has to buy hay or private pasture at $50 or $60, or buy hay at $200 a ton. All of a sudden, that what used to be a profitable calf or lamb, the profit's all gone. He's lucky to even break even, and so that develops angst. And I think as we move forward, that's one of the great challenges in our state is how to find a way to make it a win-win
Sure.
where
Balance
we
that.
don't feel like it has to be win-lose, which for some of our public lands producers, it feels win-lose right now. Yeah.
I see. And that's kind of where you talk, Justin, is we kind of can reevaluate, as we're going and see if we do need to issue more permits, hunting permits for an area that is seeing kind of those competitions.
Yeah, and that's why I was saying it's appropriate to be under objective during hard times like this, because that impact is real to the agricultural community.
Right.
The other thing that I think is really important is making sure that, drought's going to cycle in Utah. We're going to have years of good precip and then years of bad. And you look over history, and that's what it's been. And I think on these, the years that to better buffer against this, I think habitat restoration is just so critical. The projects that we do on federal land to grow more vegetation and to do treatments and some of these things, I think are really vital. And Nicole could probably speak to this better than I can, so I'll give her a chance. But when you look at like the pinyon and juniper growth that occurs on a landscape, well, that a lot of times that's part of somebody's allotment, and that's part of an elk herd or a deer herd that people really like. And so in partnering with the Watershed Restoration Initiative and the many partners, sportsmen, agriculture, whomever, it's important to go do those projects because it does offer some relief to grow the pie and to grow more vegetation. Now, years like this, sometimes those projects don't always come to fruition, or they don't produce as much as we would have hoped.
Sure.
But it beats the alternative of having these stands of pinyon and juniper that don't have any understory, no grasses, no forbs, no shrubs, nothing for deer and livestock to partake of. And so it makes it really tough, but you can probably add more than I can.
Yeah, conifer encroachment, even, lower elevation or upper elevation, it can be a real challenge and a real problem for producing enough, vegetation out there for wildlife and livestock to both utilize. So, and one example that was given to me long ago, and I've loved it, is, you need a bedroom and a kitchen out there for wildlife, and it goes for livestock too. So we try to do, right now, if you just kind of look out across the landscape, you see a whole lot of trees, which is the bedroom. And we don't see a whole lot of kitchen out there, but we need more kitchen. So we do habitat restoration. So we seed, we do mechanical treatments, we do hand treatments. We do a whole suite of habitat restoration techniques to try to get more kitchen on the ground. So it's trying to balance this bedroom and kitchen. And right now we have a whole lot of bedroom and not near enough kitchen. And this goes, lower elevation clear up to the upper elevation. We're seeing a lot of conifer encroachment into, our upper elevation aspen zones, and that's really reducing the amount of, grasses and wildflowers that are out there. And so, yeah, I think habitat restoration is kind of a big deal for a win-win for both wildlife and livestock.
Right.
And
Nicole and all our habitat biologists have the world on their shoulder in a drought year. They're like, we need to feed everybody. And yeah, and kind of touching on that, you'd mentioned some of the specific types of projects that we can do, to be able to clear out some of these not as valuable plants or trees and to grow and seed some others that are going to be more beneficial. Are there ways that we can kind of prepare for a drought year? Is that something kind of talk about that, is if there's ways to get it ready before we know it's going to get real bad, kind of like Justin was saying.
Well, you can. We can never outgas Mother Nature, so we typically seed in the fall and hope that the winter precipitation comes in and helps us get our plants to germinate. So on a drought year like this, I have seeded in the fall, and Mother Nature's going to make me look like a fool. But we got to keep trying, and the years that we do have really good precipitation, we end up with fantastic growth of grasses and wildflowers, and we'll see little tiny shrub seedlings popping up, and we get diversity on the landscape. So that's really what we're after is diversity. So yeah, preparing now by continuing to put money towards these habitat restoration treatments will help on years like this when we have drought conditions, because we do have more forage on the landscape. It might be less than it could be on a good year, but
Sure.
There's still more diversity out there than there was to begin with. So now we do have more on the landscape, even though it's less on a drought year.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just touch on something with that? You know, the watershed restoration initiative and the projects that have been done have been amazing. I mean, one area that I can think of in particular is the Kanab field office of the BLM. You know, in the past 10 years, I think they've done 100,000 acres of juniper treatment in that area. And in conjunction with that, our program, the Grazing Improvement Program, has put in about 100 miles of pipeline and new troughs. You know, for every mile of pipeline we put in, usually that's one new trough or completely new watering area that we've been able to install. And we've got a whole bunch more on the books. And literally what we're doing in many areas of Utah is making that pie bigger that Nicole referred to. And we're trying to keep ahead of that, to continue to do that, because, you know, for wildlife and especially for livestock, without water, they can't use an area. I know deer can go several days without water, but a cow can't. You know, she can go on snow for a few days and kind of get by. But really, you know, a cow needs 25 or 30 gallons of water a day to do her thing. And so that's critical. And that's where I'm glad to say the division and all of its partners with WRI have been great partners with us in that we've been able to make that pie bigger by not only providing the forage and the habitat, but providing the water that goes along with it. You know, whether that's guzzlers that we've participated in together with big aprons and big storage tanks, spring developments where we then float the system, so we keep all the water we can right in the spring, but we use what we need for livestock and wildlife in other places, or even new wells in many situations. You know, in the past couple of years, in southern Utah, we've punched 40 or 50 new wells in the ground. And those are new sources of water that haven't been there before, that are reliable, they're long-term storage, they're not nearly as affected by drought, because a lot of times we're going after water that's 1,000 feet deep and bringing it to the surface, and we've got water in areas that we never had it before. And that has literally made the pie bigger.
Yeah.
Yeah, and some of those water developments that you're talking about where, you know, we can team up together, Division of Wildlife, the Grazing Improvement Program, and do these developments that are for livestock and for wildlife. So it's all about the design and, you know, where you where you pipe the main source to. But yeah, those are some of the best projects because it's such a win-win.
It's benefiting everybody, yeah. And I did a previous episode about some guzzlers that we'd installed out in northeastern Utah, and it is a pretty impressive project. I think it's pretty ingenious. And I like that Troy touched on, you know, this is such a partnership-based thing. I mean, everybody that helps out, you know, there's a lot of funding that goes into it, and it benefits all different types of organizations and people and animals too. So how can just kind of individual people, what are some ways that they could maybe help wildlife or livestock during some of these types of drought years? What are things that they could do?
Well, I think a big thing for our recreating public, we have a lot of people out, and especially with the pandemic, it seems that outdoor recreation has exploded all over the state. One thing that's important for our producers is, and for wildlife as well, is don't camp on a water trough. Don't camp on a spring or a stream right next to it where you inhibit livestock or wildlife from accessing water, because it's critical to them.
That's important.
And, you know, be aware of those things. Move back from those areas. You know, animals don't need extra stress with a drought, so we don't need people chasing them on ATVs or four-wheelers. Let them do their thing. You know, if you see a situation, call the authorities. Don't rescue that elk calf or that fawn and take it home thinking it's in trouble.
I will slow clap for you saying that. That's one of the biggest things we're preaching all the time. Stop trying to touch and feed and rescue wildlife, and they're fine. Yeah.
And the same with our livestock protection dogs and our working dogs that are out there on the landscape. They're there on purpose. We didn't abandon them. They're doing a job. They live with the sheep in many instances. Please don't take them home. They're fine. They have a herder that takes care of them, and he feeds them, and they're in good shape. So
yep.
Let them do their thing. They're a working animal. And they're happy to do their work. They live outside, and they're very comfortable living outside, just like our wildlife. And remember that they don't need your love and attention and need to be put in the car. They're okay. They've got water. They've got food. They're making their living.
Yeah, no, that's great. Those are great points. Do you guys have anything you would want to add on just kind of what people should know, or maybe how they can help, or things to be aware of during a drought?
I think just increased understanding and maybe a little empathy, because whether you're an avid hunter or you're a livestock operator, producer, I think a lot of times when these droughts hit, people experience a lot of loss, and it's regardless of what camp you're in. I promise you, your neighbor is in the other camp, and so let's be understanding to the other side of this. I think the ag community and the wildlife community are more closely aligned than a lot of people want to think. We have individuals that want to focus on the differences, and I understand it. There's real differences that occur, but also I think it's important to realize that during drought years, our friends in the agricultural community are really impacted, and also the hunting community is really impacted. There's less animals on the landscape. They're not in as good a condition. Production wasn't nearly as good, and on and on. And so what we can do, there's some real things that you can do, like Troy mentioned, and then I think there's a little bit of soul searching we might be able to do as well to try to be a little bit more understanding to those that are impacted in different ways.
I love it. Calls for civility. I'm always about. Yeah, it is. It's tough for everybody, and I feel like I'm kind of in a unique situation. My dad is a rancher. He's a beef cattle rancher, so I've seen that side of things and the impacts. And he is so stressed about there's no water, there's no feed, and we're paying to have to take him to a feedlot as well. And then my family does run a CWMU, and so I see that side of things and the impacts of hunting. And so it's interesting, and it's hard for everybody. So I think just being understanding, like you mentioned, and kind of having that compassion and kindness, is super important. So kind of touching on that as well, Justin. What can hunters kind of expect going into the fall this year?
Probably fire restrictions. No, there'll certainly be some of that. But I think, during drought years, a lot of the energy that animals typically put in antler growth isn't there. Antler growth is a secondary growth characteristic. So an animal is always going to take care of its structure, its fat reserves, those types of things to make sure it can get through a winter. But then beyond that, that's when the antler growth occurs. And so during a drought year, leading up to a drought year, a lot of times antler growth isn't going to be as big. And it's not because we're not trying to do our best to manage wildlife, but that's just one of the impacts of Mother Nature and drought. And I joked about the fire situation, but I do think that's important as well. Sometimes when we have fires on our lower elevation ranges, our winter ranges, that's really, really bad for wildlife. And they've been stressed all year nutritionally on the summer range, and then they come back to just ash on the winter range, and that really has an impact for animals. And then sometimes fire can be good. It's one of the silver linings of drought, and I know it's a sensitive topic to talk about because fire has some real negatives when it comes to structures and different things like that can be burned or burning up an allotment, and then where does that individual go? There's some real things that can occur, but and the long term, sometimes fire is really healthy for these systems, and we've seen great benefits in many parts of the state shortly after a drought and a heavy fire season that have really benefited wildlife and livestock because the amount of forage and regeneration has just been incredible. So,
kind of resets the habitat in that area, gets out the not as beneficial stuff, brings in some newer beneficial stuff. Yeah,
the newer growth after a disturbance like fire, it has a really high nutritional value. So having these disturbances like fire really can be a positive thing on the ecosystem. But like Justin said, there can be negative impacts from fire, but there can also be some really, really good positive impacts.
Sure. But with that said, I feel like to give a shout out to our sister agency, Forestry Fire State Lands, don't be the one that sets a fire. Do what you can. Douse your campfires. Don't be an idiot. Just be safe when you're out this summer because it is dry.
I think our aquatic section would echo those comments. So.
Yes.
I've worked on plenty of stream restoration projects, and there definitely can be negative impacts on the ecosystem. I've talked to county officials. There's impacts on roadways. like there can be a lot of impacts, but there can also be a lot of good. So it's kind of trying to find that happy medium of, like, you know, that understanding that Justin was talking about. Like there's good and bad in all situations.
Totally. Yeah. Well, I'm appreciative of you guys coming on today to kind of talk about some of these tough issues and kind of give a deeper understanding to some of our listeners on it is a hard year, it's going to be a hard year, and just kind of have those expectations and that mindset, and to be, you know, a little compassionate as we're going into the summer and late fall, when I'm sure things will just keep getting drier. So thanks for listening. And as always, if you haven't yet, we'd love if you could subscribe to the Wild Podcast. We release a new episode on the third Tuesday of each month, and we hope that you'll join us next month for some more wildlife stories.